Hey Grace Church, I hope everybody had an amazing Thanksgiving week last week. This is the week of the 27th, and I want to welcome you to the weekly. We're going to talk about the scripture from Sunday. It's Mark 11, verses 12 to 25, and what I called somewhat of a scripture sandwich, because it starts with a story, it goes into another story, and then it circles back to the original or to the top story. So let's discuss. Okay guys, so the verses this week that we went through and that I've studied and that I preached on about Sunday are so interesting. So here's what's happening. I'm going to summarize most of it for you. So Jesus and the disciples, they leave a town called Bethany and they go on their way to Jerusalem, and on the way they're hungry naturally, right? And so they're walking, and so Jesus and the disciples, they see this fig tree. And Jesus goes up to it, and it looks like it's good to go, but he goes up to it and there's no fruit on the tree. And so he goes up to it, and this is what he says in verse 14. He said to it, Jesus says to the tree, he speaks to the tree, and he says this, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard it, he says. So Jesus, how strange, right? If you were there, Jesus walks up and it looks like it would have fruit. It does not have fruit. And he looked at the tree and he spoke to it, and he in essence curses the fig tree. And then the story takes a turn, and this is where the sandwich comes into play. So that's the top part of the sandwich. That's the first story. And then the scripture goes into another place. And so the disciples and Jesus, they go into Jerusalem, and the first place they go to is the temple. And so Jesus does some things that I would say are interesting, and we did dissect that on Sunday. But what he does is he goes in, and there's people buying and selling in the outer parts of the temple marketplace. And he goes, and it says he drives out certain people who were exchanging money and buying and selling and doing those things, and he overturns tables of those money changers. And so you're like, what is happening here? Well, then they leave, some more things happen, and then they leave in that evening. And the next morning they start walking again, and they pass by that fig tree, and Peter notices something. And he points it out, and he says, "You guys, look at that tree. It's withered, it's dead." And so, oh man, what happens between the fig tree to the temple and then back to the fig tree, there's so much to uncover, and there's so much to talk through and dissect, and I'm not going to get into all those details, but here's what I want us to look at. And what's interesting is, like, Jesus seems kind of mad, or I dare say even mean towards the tree and towards the people in the temple. Like, what is happening here? And so this is what I want us to think about as we enter into discussion in a few moments. First is about the fig tree. What we have to understand about fig trees is they were walking towards Jerusalem on their way, and it's almost Passover. So this would be about March or April. And so what we need to know about fig trees is that harvest season, they're fully mature, fully ripe, fully ready in about June. But what we would know about fig trees, or what we should know and educate ourselves about, is that fig trees, even when they're immature, they sprout these little leaves on them, and they have these little nodules, these immature little pieces of figs that aren't quite figs yet. But it was often common in Israel and in Palestine in those times where you can eat those immature little nodules, and they're good for you, and people often ate them. Today, if you were to travel to Jerusalem, you would probably go into the marketplace and see someone selling them in a basket and selling these, and you would just snack on them and eat them, and they were good. So here's this fig tree. It looks and it appears to be where it should be, as in growing and developing, March or April already, growing towards June, towards harvest. And so from afar, it looks like it would have those nodules on them that are edible. And so Jesus walks up and he notices that there are none. What that means in that moment is, because it doesn't have any premature, immature figs on it in April, May, it will not have mature figs in June. So although it appears like it's good, it is not good, and it does not bear fruit. This is a fig tree that appears to bear fruit, and it doesn't. So that's that story of the fig tree. Pause. Let's go into the temple. when they go into Jerusalem and they go into the temple, in the very outer courts of those temples in those days, those were the areas for the Gentiles. And a lot of times when a Gentile would enter into the covenant with Yahweh, with God, they would have to sacrifice an animal. So they would travel into the main city, into the main temple, and they would bring an animal to sacrifice. This was the covenant between God and man to pay for their sins. And so they would bring, but the animals had to be, in the scriptures it says, without blemish. So it had to be pure and good and perfect and a good animal to sacrifice for sins. And so they would bring, and so they were almost going at their own risk, and however far they had to travel to come into the temple. And sometimes something would happen to the animal and they would have to exchange it or buy a new animal that was unblemished in order to sacrifice. And so in the outer courts, the Gentiles would enter in. That's where they were allowed to meet with God, to pray to God, and to sacrifice. But what was happening, secular historians will tell you this, biblical scholars will tell you the same thing, is that the Jews would set up a marketplace in these outer courts, and they would, in essence, manipulate and rip off the Gentile believers. And so that they would basically say, something's wrong with your animal, you have to buy mine and mark it up, and they would sell it for a profit. And so this was not something that God would want, Yahweh would want, or be approved of, and that certainly Jesus as the Messiah would not be approved of. So this temple is a place that is good and pure and holy, and a place to meet with God and reconcile between God and man. But while this temple was supposed to be that, it was not what it appeared to be. So here's something so interesting. You have a fig tree, because these stories look so different, and like, how do they relate? This is how they relate. A fig tree, this particular tree, was not what it appeared to be. And Jesus had to get close to see that it was not what it appeared to be. Jesus had to enter into the temple. The temple was not what it appeared to be, which is why he got mad at what was happening. Many times in our church and even within us, we appear to be of God. We appear to be God's people and living right and doing right. But oftentimes we are not. And so here's what I want you to remember this statement. Growth without fruit is a sign of decay. Real spiritual growth and closeness with God will produce fruit. So when you don't see fruit, it's a sign of decay. And so these are the thoughts I want you to have of these two stories, this scripture sandwich from verses 12 to 25 as we enter into the discussion. So now I will turn it over to your house church leader.